Hey, three is a magic number. This is episode 3 of Economy 101. I'm Dan Loney here in Philadelphia, joined by economist Aaron Terrazas, who joins us from the West Coast in the beautiful city of Seattle after he spent a couple of days in my hometown last week. Aaron, good to talk to you again. How are you, sir?
Great to be back, Dan. Always fun to chat.
Well, I understand you did get your cheesesteak, so that's good when you were
Indeed.
here. But you were here for the National Association of Business Economics annual meeting. And I guess let's go through the meeting, what all occurred, because I think anytime you get a meeting like this and you have some of the people that were there, especially in the economy situation we're in now, it becomes that much more important.
That's right. This was the annual meeting, as you said, of the National Association for Business Economics. This is the big national group that brings together high and low, everyone from very senior policymakers at the Fed and in government, all the way down to people who run forecasting and do the nuts and bolts work at companies around the country. I've always appreciated at these conferences there are very nuanced views. Kind of, we're not quite as perfectly aligned as a profession as is sometimes characterized out there, and a real engagement with kind of contrarian, different debating perspectives. The theme this year was the global economy in transition, finding opportunities amid disruption. And I think the conversation in general, as I look back on it, was really focused on three big topics: trade, immigration, and Fed independence. All of those are in flux right now.
Any personal highlights for you?
I mean, obviously, the personal highlight was the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, came in and gave a keynote address. But I'll say, perhaps unexpected highlight was a concluding panel with three former regional Fed presidents, Charles Evans, Patrick Harker, and Loretta Mester. They were formerly presidents of the Chicago, Philly, and Cleveland Feds. And I think it's always fascinating to hear from former officials. Anyone who's been around DC knows that former officials are almost universally more interesting than current officials. They're a little bit liberated from institutional constraints, and happy to kind of go into some of their comments. But I think they were really thoughtful in their remarks.
Well, and it's interesting for Pat Harker, being the former president of the University of Pennsylvania, and now he is back there. The experience that he has both from an educational and obviously an economic perspective running the Philadelphia Fed of where things stand right now. And he's been kind of, very forthright about the potential of more rate cuts to come.
That's right. I think that these officials are liberated from the constraints of being inside the institution. Typically they have extensive academic background and training. Yes, I think kind of it was, in some ways this group, these three former officials aligned with some of Powell's comments. This idea that the Fed is probably going to be a little bit more cautious about big asset purchases, in the future, unlike, they were from the lessons of the past decade.
Right.
I think there was a real debate, including from former President Harker, about whether or not the recent tariff shock is transitory. I think that's a question that is on a lot of folks' mind right now.
That's a rough word to use. If I remember going back in time, transitory is not a nice word to use.
In fact, President Harker kind of said, he has PTSD from that word, and we're hearing a lot of kind of Chairman Powell will say that the consensus expectation is that tariffs will be a one-time pass-through, so they can look past it. It's not going to permanently shift inflation or interest rates.
Yeah.
I've articulated in the past some skepticism that there are a few other economies who are the trading partners that have the price discipline that China does, and so we may see more kind of a higher rate of inflation moving forward. I think kind of their view was a little bit more nuanced. That their view was that the pass through from tariffs to inflation is this sequence of overlapping delayed shocks, and it's really hard to tell what is temporary versus what is permanent when you get these kind of delayed overlapping waves over months, if not years. And so even if it is ultimately transitory, it could go on for several years, and then that becomes a problem.
So since we last talked, we now know that we will get inflation data. We had kind of speculated that maybe it would come at the end of the month. We'll actually get it next week. So we'll get a little bit of a better sense on where things stand with inflation. And I guess that is kind of one of the biggest questions out there, is that with tariffs in play and potentially what impact they are having, why we aren't seeing more of an impact. I think the natural assumption is tariffs were going to lead to higher inflation, but it just hasn't occurred to that level right now.
I think you're absolutely right, and there was a lot of engagement with this question about why didn't it hit more quickly? What strategies were businesses using? I think on the first, I'll say there was a little bit of a kind of a recognition that earlier this year was perhaps an egg on the face kind of moment for economists. That the world is a lot more complex, the interactions are a lot more complex across policies than simple models suggest, and we need to keep that in mind. Inflation didn't hit immediately in April and May, and there are a number of reasons for that. There were companies evading them. They had built up inventory. They were reluctant to immediately alienate their customers with price hikes if these were going to go away through subsequent negotiations. So there was a little bit of the settling of the dust. That said, I think the universal consensus kind of there was still companies are facing higher price pressure. You see that in wholesale inflation. You see that in all of their comments. Sooner or later, that is going to pass through. They can't, hold that line forever. And these, delaying strategies are gonna kind of end at some point. So I think kind of there was a recognition that we need to be a little bit more humble in our assessments and our predictions about the future. That businesses are complicated, more complicated than economic models, but ultimately they still ring true.
How much was immigration a topic of conversation at NABE, and what were the general thoughts on what we're seeing play out around immigration and the impacts that it may be having on the economy, especially with many people being deported?
It was a big topic. I think one of the big questions for policymakers, and Chairman Powell engaged with this, was the idea that why hasn't the unemployment rate increased as the labor market seems to be softening, as payroll gains are declining sharply, as we hear all these stories about how people are having a hard time finding jobs. And I think the consensus there was that immigration is at the very least playing a part in why job openings have collapsed without a big increase in the unemployment rate. That's not typically what you expect. I think one of the really interesting questions that folks grappled with at the conference was this idea that break-even payroll gains, the number of jobs we need to create each month just to keep up with population growth. A decade ago we used to say, oh, it's 150, maybe 200,000 jobs. A month was like a solid month where unemployment wasn't increasing. The range of estimates now are much lower. You hear 50,000, you hear a few numbers even below zero, and the confidence intervals around those estimates are, include zero. So we could have a situation where we get a negative payroll print, payrolls decline, and it's not necessarily bad for the economy. Just think about what a mind-twisting world that is. It almost harkens back to the zero lower bound conversations about what a stable inflation rate is. It's hard to tell a contraction from a small expansion.
So I think that, and I've talked a lot about that component as well, and I want to further the discussion on it because a lot of people have talked about the lower birth rate we have seen in recent years and how that could potentially impact what we're going to see in the labor force down the road. And then obviously you have the component of AI. So to a degree, this is it feels like a learning experience. We're kind of going through something new where the dynamics are, we really don't know what the potential next 20, 30 years are going to look like around labor because of all of these dynamics at play.
You're absolutely right. And, this question about labor immigration, it's hard really to talk about all labor immigrants in the same breath. I think there was a recognition that with AI, the skill frontier is pushing outward. We hear all these companies saying how much more they can do with fewer software engineers, how much more code they're writing, how much more service calls they're able to handle with chatbots. So that's one end, kind of where in some ways labor demand has shifted inward is less. But a lot of the conversation at this conference, we had kind of the CEO of a major home builder come speak, and in the construction sector, in agriculture, there is still a chronic shortage of workers to pick fruit and vegetables to build homes. Many of those jobs are skilled jobs, and so I think we need to. It was telling. There was a moment where the CEO asked the audience, who is encouraging their children to go into construction, in the construction trades?
Right.
No one raised their hand. And I think that's a problem. These are jobs that our society doesn't encourage, but these are jobs that our economy desperately needs.
Well, and in many cases, you can have a great living and have a great life having
Yeah.
a job like that. And that, I think, you lead into another issue, is that these are the type of jobs that maybe haven't been as attractive to many Americans in recent years.
Yeah, in my mind, you're absolutely right. These are attractive jobs where you can make well into the triple digits a couple of years after training. The child question from the CEO was a little bit of a misleading question in my mind. One of the lessons I've kind of take away from my time working in the trucking industry was that some of these jobs are no one's first choice.
Sure.
People come to these careers after the previous attempts fail in their career. So in some ways, filling these construction jobs in particular, perhaps not as much in agriculture, but filling these construction jobs, electricians, plumbers, general contractors, really requires us to help people pivot mid-career. And we don't have a system for that.
Let's finish up with the Federal Reserve and the topic of Fed independence, which I'm sure was on the minds of quite a few of the former Fed leaders and probably a lot of the people that were there at the conference.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think there was a thoughtful conversation, both in the panels and across kind of the more private conversations. Obviously, no one was advocating a subordination of monetary policy of the Fed, of central banks to budget goals and fiscal policy. Right. I think the overwhelming evidence of what happens, when you do that, you think of places like Argentina, kind of China, where inflation just becomes a pervasive problem, and in general, the consensus there is still nothing good comes of that. But I think there was also a recognition that independence is just more than an executive branch who doesn't comment on the Fed. We've had it feels like unprecedented comments about kind of Fed decisions from the executive branch, but that's not necessarily a loss of independence until it starts changing decisions. Right. And there are a lot of built-in mechanisms inside the Fed, inside conversations with public markets. They have to have credible debates. So I think kind of this idea that you have to convince smart, independent people, both among your Fed colleagues and in financial markets, that's not going to go away. That's not going to go away because someone is pushing you to do one thing or another.
All right, Aaron, I appreciate your time this week. Thanks very much, and we will catch up with you again next week.
Thanks, Dan. Always fun.
You got it. Aaron Terrazas, economist, joining us here on episode number 3 of Economy 101.